Up next on Afterwards, syndicated columnist Naomi Klein discusses current politics in her book, No Is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. She's interviewed by Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink.
So Naomi, lovely to get a chance to interview you on a book I just found fantastic. I read it voraciously, I think in one long sitting, and found it absolutely fascinating. And my first question to you is, how in the world were you able to write this so quickly? Because you reference things that just happened in April, May, and the book just came out.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Medea. It's great to speak with you. I'm glad that you enjoyed the book. Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a frenzy to writing this book. I usually take about 5 years to write books. That's been my average. I publish a new book about every 7 years. I give myself a little break between, about 5 full years. This book, I just wanted to get it out as quickly as possible. There are a couple of chapters in the book that are focused on what we should expect if there is a crisis in the United States, if there's an economic crisis or a major security crisis. And I felt so passionately that there needed to be some political disaster preparedness among progressives. That I just wrote at a speed I frankly never written before, and I also worked with a publisher that was really committed to getting it out really quickly too, because the publishing industry can be quite slow. Usually, you finish the book and then it sort of creeps along the production process and all of these stages for another 4 months. And in this case, everybody just worked so hard to get it out in record-breaking time. So I'm really lucky to have worked with a publisher who is as committed to to get to this political moment as I am.
I think it's a great contribution to millions of people who are looking at our political situation right now and thinking, what do I do? And obviously from the title of the book, you give it away that no is not enough. But I also see the book as an amazing coming together of your work that begins with the no logo and the branding, into the shock doctrine, and even with your climate work about this changes everything. It seems like you are the quintessential anti-Trump, and that your work really embodies everything that is the opposite of what Trump stands for. So maybe we should start with what you start the beginning of the book, which is looking at Trump as the quintessential branding. Yeah,
and the truth, Medea, as you know, is that so many of us have been on this journey. Some of my early work as a journalist, before I'd published any books at all, was focused on what I would describe as the underside of branding. I focused on what's beneath the shine behind those beautiful logos and transcendent marketing. Marketing got better and better in the 1990s. It sort of turned into high art, in the era of Nike and Michael Jordan. But behind those, as companies upped the ante in marketing and design, they really divested from the world of work. They sold off their factories. They started outsourcing to a web of contractors and subcontractors and giving contracts to whoever was willing to produce their products as cheaper. I say we've been on this journey a long time because, of course, your work at Global Exchange in the 90s was part of this process of exposing the horrific conditions under which some of the most valuable brands in the world, Nike, Disney, were making their products, right? So I look at Trump as this hollow brand, and by hollow I mean one of these companies that adopted this paradigm of we are not in the product business, right? This was this was the big shift that I was tracking in No Logo was it used to be really up until the 80s that the iconic brands in the American marketplace were manufacturers first. They made products and then they branded those products with logos and they marketed them. But in the 90s, the order flipped, and you started to see companies announcing that they were marketers first. They were in the ideas business, and they projected their big idea onto as many extensions of their brand as possible, and started building these sort of self-enclosed branded cocoons. Disney in this period opened a branded town, Celebration, Florida, so you could live inside your favorite brand. And Trump did this in real estate. He started off as a pretty traditional real estate developer, but quickly went into this stratosphere of these super brands. The Apprentice was an enormous breakthrough for him, where it became less about building buildings and more about building his brand and then selling his name, his brand, for very, very high prices to other developers who wanted to have that Trump name on the side of their condo tower, on the side of their resort. And like those other brands that I mentioned earlier, this came often at the expense of workers. We've heard many stories of terrible conditions for workers in Trump-owned properties, and also making Trump or Ivanka branded clothing around the world.
So here you have a guy who can make millions of dollars in one building just by allowing them to put his name on it, and then he becomes president. And as you say in the book, it's impossible to really separate out Trump and his family and the family businesses, including, of course, Ivanka's clothing line, and the president now. So groups that are trying to...
Because I don't think they can separate it, Medea.
No?
Like, I don't think Trump knows where his personal identity ends and his commercial brand begins.
Well, I love this line in the book. You can't disentangle Trump, the man, from Trump, the brand. Those two entities, you say, merged long time ago. Every time he sets foot in one of his properties, a golf club, a hotel, a beach club, the White House press corps in tow, he is increasing his overall brand value, which allows his company to sell more memberships, rent more rooms, and increase fees. So yes, how could you possibly separate this man from the brand?
And the particular challenge of Trump is he enters politics not playing by the traditional rules of the game, but playing by the traditional rules of branding. And the only rule of branding is stay true to your brand. So in the 1990s, many activists exposed that companies like Nike and Disney were sort of betraying the promise of their brand, which maybe was empowerment for girls, or a family-friendly and kid-friendly ethos, because their products were being made under conditions that were abusive to young people in those factories. And so they were vulnerable on that front, and they had to be responsive. But Trump is a really different entity, is a different kind of brand, because the big idea that Trump has always sold was the idea of absolute power through wealth. This was the promise of the Trump brand since the 80s, since he published his first brand extension, which was The Art of the Deal. He was selling the promise that you can be a kind of a, he loves the word killer. He doesn't mean it literally, but just, somebody who's just out for themselves, willing to step on anyone. When he describes the art of the deal, it's really essentially about screwing over other people and ending up on top, not coming to any kind of mutually beneficial agreement. And so he's the guy who gets away with it. And he has a consumer base that wants to be him, that has an aspirational identity with him, a consumer base that feels that they have lost power on many different fronts, and Trump represents the attainment of the kind of power that they want. And that's a real problem when it comes to holding Trump accountable to his brand promise, right? If you catch him lying, if you catch him cheating, if you catch him being nasty, any things that might hurt a traditional politician, or even a brand whose brand identity had sort of more ethical, aspirational components, Trump is not hurt by any of this because it all confirms his identity as the guy who gets away with anything because he's so rich. This is a challenge. The only way you can really hurt the Trump brand is by proving that he's not as powerful as he seems to be. This is why he's very bothered when people talk about President Bannon or the idea that the strings are being pulled by Putin. That hurts his brand identity because his brand identity is all about being the boss.
And this word emoluments that I don't think most Americans ever heard of before, but is now being bandied around.
Sounds like moisturizer.
Yes. Yeah. But now that there are lawsuits in court trying to say that Donald Trump is making money illegally from the presidency by, I don't know if it's just foreign entities. Is it just foreign entities like governments of Saudi Arabia and others taking rooms and renting up his hotels as part of ill-gotten gains? Do you think there's anything to that? Is that really illegal?
It may well be, and it's been interesting timing with the release of the book, because just as the book came out, actually the day the book came out, the news came that the attorneys general of D.C. and also Maryland had launched this a lawsuit alleging a violation of the Constitution on those grounds, and then 190 lawmakers in Congress filed a lawsuit of their own. And that one is really significant because what the Constitution says is that the president cannot do this without the permission of Congress, right? So the people who are, there already was a lawsuit that had been filed by a DC restaurant, I believe, and also a group of restaurant workers who were making this allegation. But the significance of Congress people filing their own emoluments lawsuit is that they are the ones who should have been consulted, right? So they really have the most legitimacy as a party, it would seem, to make this challenge. And you know, we may well discover that Trump is not as immune as he thinks he is and has been behaving as if he is. And one thing I would just add, Medea, is that a lot of the examples we've heard for how he's receiving gifts, maybe receiving gifts or benefits from foreign governments, have focused on these hotel rooms. And you know, and I think there is a case to be made that foreign governments are deciding to stay at the Trump Hotel, deciding to have expensive events at Trump properties to ingratiate themselves to the president and hopefully, you know, get into his good graces. But there are other things to look at as well, including the fact that the Chinese government has been granting a wave of trademarks to both Trump and Ivanka to sell their products in China. What I am most disturbed by is something that I don't think has gotten nearly enough media attention, which is that the Chinese government has detained labor monitors who were investigating conditions in one of Ivanka's factories. That would seem to me to be a very tangible benefit. And I think the allegation is not that these governments are being directed to do this by Trump. It's that they see that this president has not divested, and they believe that these are favors that they can do to get themselves into the good graces of a president who is clearly very, very concerned about his personal and family wealth, right? So you don't need to prove that, you know, Ivanka is on the phone going, arrest those people. No, that's not the allegation. The allegation would be that the Chinese government, you know, would think that it would be a helpful thing to do to get rid of those pesky whistleblowers.
Well, one of the points that you make in the book is that this is not anything new, that you talk about the decades that the Clintons had been using their foundation as a place where people could give money to curry favor with them. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how the stage was set for Trump.
Right, and this is, you know, it's, I guess my overarching goal in writing the book, other than getting it out before there's a major crisis, was to try to challenge this, you know, I think this narrative, because Trump is so unlike any president before. There is this idea that he kind of is a Martian, that sort of stormed an otherwise functioning system, and if he could only be impeached, then everything would be fine. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying one way or another on impeachment. Obviously, if he's committed impeachable offenses, he should be impeached. But that will just get us where we were before Trump, and that was the ground that created Trump. It was not a safe place. It's nothing to prevent somebody else who combines an even more dangerous mix of these qualities that Trump has from taking power once again. And so, yeah, and I see this as very much a bipartisan process, the table that was set for Trump. And it isn't just about politics. It's about media. It's about news coverage. The table was set for him in so many ways that all he needed to do was just show up, because it was sort of, we were already treating elections like reality TV shows. We already had a media landscape that was much more interested in interpersonal dramas between candidates than in in-depth coverage of the issues. We already had Democrats using the tools of corporate branding themselves. President Obama was a fantastic brand. He used incredibly cutting-edge marketing techniques, and a lot of us felt that there was that behind the claims that he was leading this deep change and transformation, that there wasn't enough change, and that also helped set the table for Trump. Something else that set the table for Trump, I believe, was this liberal idea that the Clintons were really central to, which was all about how billionaires could use the great wealth that they amassed in the period of deregulation and privatization to fix problems that we traditionally look to governments to solve. So if you look at the Clinton Global Initiative, you mentioned that currying of favor, I think even more significant is this whole model of what the Clinton Global Initiative was doing was bringing the billionaires of the world together with policymakers, and you would have a big announcement from Richard Branson that he was going to solve climate change with the profits from his airlines, and this was the biggest gift in the history of the Clinton Foundation. As it turns out, he didn't make good on the promise of the money, or certainly didn't solve climate change. But there was no accountability, because unlike government, it's all voluntary. And so I think that model, Bill Gates has tremendous power over the U.S. education system. He has tremendous power over Africa's healthcare system. He plays a role that is similar to what the World Health Organization used to do. And many people argue that he's more powerful than the World Health Organization. And, Bill Gates does lots of good things in the world, but this idea with the billionaire savior complex, I think, helped create a context where Donald Trump could stand before the American people and say, trust me because I'm rich. Because we were already, as a culture, acting as if the ability to make a lot of money in one area bestowed just kind of infinite wisdom on this tiny group of billionaires, and even if they had no experience in health or education, they had tremendous power because of their wealth. And so how different is that from Trump's pitch to voters of, sure, I don't have any qualifications and any experience in government, but I'm so rich that you can trust me to fix America.
Well, you also talk about setting the stage in terms of going back to Reagan, for example, as government being part of the problem, private is the solution. Then you talk about the Clinton era and the deregulation of the banks, and then the failure of President Obama to do anything to hold the bankers accountable, and how this also set the stage for an economic system that has allowed the transfer of wealth to be so enormously skewed in our society. And now you just have been talking, Naomi, about the people who enter into government, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how the Trump administration has taken it to extreme, where you say they've eliminated the middleman, that you don't have to wine and dine the people in office anymore, because the corporations are the ones in office right now.
Right. So once again, this is not a process that Trump started, but he is taking it into new territory. and to appoint, for instance, the CEO of Exxon as Secretary of State. I mean, there have certainly been Secretaries of State in U.S. history who had ties with corporate America. Dulles, probably most significant example. Baker. I mean, like, this is not a new process, but to be the CEO of Cheney, and Cheney very significantly, right? And I think the biggest difference is one of optics. Halliburton was a company that most people hadn't heard of before Cheney, right? It's a hugely important company, but it's not a highly branded company. So appointing the CEO of Exxon, which is really not only a highly branded company, but one of the most controversial companies in the world, under investigation by 3 states' attorneys general over allegations that it had misled its shareholders about how much it knew about climate change, because Exxon's own scientists had been researching the reality of climate change back in the 70s and 80s, and then funded climate change denial in the 1990s. Exxon was under a lot of pressure when Trump appointed the CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson, who'd been at Exxon his entire working life, had never worked anywhere but Exxon, worked there for 41 years. And so it is a continuation of all of that road, that same road, from Dulles to Cheney to Tillerson, and of course Trump himself, because at least Tillerson divested from Exxon before becoming Secretary of State. Trump has just merged, it seems, the Trump organization with the White House.
Except, as you talk about so eloquently in the book, this is now the ultimate giveaway to corporate America. So maybe we should talk about how the initial, I mean, we're not even 6 months into this administration, and what has this administration been doing to go through the top wish lists of the fossil fuel companies, of the bankers, of the military-industrial complex? What are the items we already see that has pleased corporate America?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I do think this should be getting a lot more attention, Medea, because there's a lot of focus on exposing what some people believe is a conspiracy between the Trump administration and the Russians, and surely that should be investigated. But there is also a kind of a conspiracy in plain sight. I mean, there is this systematic and orderly transfer of wealth from the lower and middle incomes to the 1% of the 1%. It really is the connective tissue of everything that the Trump administration is doing on the economic front. So, if you look at the 15% corporate tax that Trump has announced that he wants to introduce. Obviously, this is a massive gift to all of corporate America. Getting rid of the estate tax, is something that only benefits the very wealthy and has been on the wish list of major Republican donors for a very long time. Trump may be the one that gets it through, precisely because so much attention is focused on what Trump in the 80s called the Trump show. He said the show is Trump, and it's sold out everywhere. And that was when he turned his extramarital affair with Marla Maples into a live-action soap opera. He has always understood the power of distraction. Now, I think some of the Trump show now is being orchestrated by Trump. I think he likes to leak information about his palace dramas. Of course, much of it is being foisted on him. He clearly does not like the investigation, the Russia investigation. But all of this is drawing our eyes away from what is happening on the economic front. If we look at what he's doing on climate, it's a huge giveaway to the oil, gas, and coal industry. The deregulation, I mean, just something like, one of the first things he did was roll back Obama's initiative to increase fuel efficiency standards. Another one of his very early decisions was to go after new requirements introduced at the end of the Obama administration to better document methane leaks in the gas industry, because we actually don't know the extent to which the gas industry, in particular fracking, is leading to a major spike in methane emissions, because it's really not tracked very well. So there was new measures that companies were going to have to abide by, and this is one of the first things that Trump has moved to eliminate. Very, very profitable. It also means that we will not have accurate information about how much emissions are going up under Trump. So those are a few examples. The whole healthcare plan that Trump celebrated in the Rose Garden is a huge giveaway, a backdoor tax giveaway, a backdoor redistribution of wealth. And I think it's really unfortunate that we haven't focused on this enough, the budget's attacks on Social Security and healthcare, because this really goes against what Trump promised on the campaign trail. And I do think he is vulnerable. His brand is vulnerable, perhaps not the Trump brand, but the Make America Great brand had a very particular promise about bringing back jobs. Another broken promise, another giveaway, I think, is what we're going to see with trade. Trump promised to renegotiate NAFTA and other trade deals so that they would be better for workers, that it would be a new era of fair trade. Meanwhile, his Commerce Secretary is reassuring business audiences that they're going to renegotiate NAFTA to make it more like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the deal that Trump tore up or withdrew the United States from, on one of his first days in office. So if, this is where I actually think he's much more vulnerable, and unfortunately, it's getting a fraction of the attention it deserves, because the Trump show never stops and it's always sold out.
One of the statistics I loved in your book was that Trump met with 190 different executives of corporations in the first 3 months in office. And then when there were some news reports about that, what they decided to do is not make public the list of people who visit the White House anymore. And I totally agree with you.
So much of this, yeah.
I was going to say that the focus on Russia is taking our eyes off of so many things. On the military-industrial complex front, the fact that the already bloated Pentagon budget is now, according to Trump, not big enough, and he wants to increase it with another $54 billion. And when he announced that, the stocks of the weapons industries just shot up. But there is no attention being paid to that.
But it's more than that. It's more than that, Medea. I mean, Trump is basically a traveling weapons salesman. This is what this seems to be the sum total of his foreign policy. He goes to Saudi Arabia, he praises them. Why? Because they've just purchased a whole bunch of U.S. weapons. And he sends a message to the world, this is how you get in America's good graces. You buy a lot of weapons. This is what Trump likes. So now Qatar has done the same thing. They've just announced a huge new weapons increase. And that this is how they're trying to cool down tensions with Saudi Arabia. He goes to NATO, a NATO summit, and he lectures NATO members on "quote unquote" not pulling their weight. Well, I'm a dual Canadian American citizen, and the Canadian Prime Minister went home and announced a massive increase in military spending, a 70% increase. So this is how the world, unfortunately, is responding to Trump. They're seeing that the way you get in the good graces of this administration is by buying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons. So it isn't just about the military increase in the United States; it's global.
But let's also do what you do so beautifully in the book in setting the stage. Recognize that it was under the Obama administration that countries like Saudi Arabia became the #1 weapons purchaser under Obama, who bragged at the White House website that they had sold $110 billion to this repressive, extremist, intolerant, misogynist regime. So there again, we see the stage set by the Democrats who preceded Trump. And so here you've set the stage, and you talked about people getting prepared for the shocks to come, but you also talk about what people are doing to resist Trump now. And the whole premise of your book of No is Not Enough does look at what has been done in the first several months of the Trump administration with people rising up. So maybe we should spend a little time on that and then move to why that's not enough.
Right. So we have seen this incredible wave of resistance, and we've seen that it can win. I mean, the travel ban, most notably, the Muslim travel ban, and that amazing surge of people going to airports across the country and just saying no, just rejecting this. And I think that emboldening local officials and Congress people to also go to the airport, lawyers, and maybe even giving some courage to judges to stand up to Trump. So that's one example. I think everybody who I know who's involved in political organizing is saying that they've never seen the level of interest, the more people showing up to rallies. Obviously, the Women's March, from day one, record-breaking numbers at the Women's March. People want to get involved. They want to understand their democracy better. They're educating themselves. A lot of white people trying to do internal work to understand their own internal racism, showing up more for racial justice. And this is really inspiring, and I think there's a collective memory of September 11th, and a lot of people have described being in shock that this could happen, trying to respond in ways that deepen solidarity, that make us more shock resistant, and this is really important because if there is, heaven forbid, a Manchester-like attack in the United States, we already know how Trump would respond, or at least in part, because when the Manchester attacks happened, he immediately blamed immigrants. He said, this is about immigrants flooding across our borders, even though the bomber in that case had been born in the United Kingdom. After the London Bridge attacks, Trump tweeted that night, this is why we need the travel ban. So there are a lot of things that are still on the Trump agenda, some of which have been stopped by this resistance, and some of which they haven't even tried to do. Betsy DeVos's education agenda is extremely radical. She really doesn't believe in public education. And so, I'm concerned about a security shock like Manchester. I'm also concerned about an economic crisis because, of course, they're deregulating the banks. They're making it more likely that there would be another 2008-like crisis, and that would then become the pretext to privatize Social Security, to further attack the public education system. And that's why I think it is so important for progressives to, yes, we have to say no, but I think we have to develop a common agenda that we will advance when these shocks hit, or even if they don't, we need to be advancing a progressive agenda. But one of the things that I have found from covering societies in the midst of major crisis now for over 2 decades is that saying no might be able to slow it down a little bit. But it really is not enough. And I think about being in Greece after the 2008 financial crisis, and the ways in which the Greek people came together, very courageously to reject what they saw as being forced to pay for the crisis of the bankers with slashed wages, with austerity, and people occupied plazas and elected another government. Said no at the polls, said no in the streets. But there wasn't really enough of a bold vision for what kind of economy they wanted instead. So I make the case in the book for us to do the work to come up with people's platforms, for a forward-looking vision for real economic, racial, and environmental justice that is really bold, that can inspire people, because I think that that's really our best defense against demagogues who are tapping into real pain, right, and mixing it with some very, very insidious ideas, is to hold out that promise of really of a better life. And we saw with the campaign of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, that when he issued his manifesto, which is a very bold document that is about fully funded public health care, that's about getting rid of tuition fees, that's about a bold transition to renewable energy and creating huge numbers of green jobs, that is really what inspired people, particularly young people, to turn out in record numbers.
I think also the fact that he took on the foreign policy issues, and after there were those attacks in England, rather than just saying the platitudes, he said we have to look at our policies overseas, our intervention in Libya, our overthrowing of Gaddafi, and how this creates resentment and blowback back at home, which unfortunately there are not major politicians in the United States who have been willing to say that.
But that may change. You know, I think people are paying attention to how the atmosphere has shifted. You know, when Jeremy Corbyn did that, when he talked about the underlying causes, he was absolutely savaged in the British press, and you know, his comments were described as monstrous by Theresa May's Tories. But it didn't hurt him. It may have helped him, because I think there is, at this late stage in the failed war on terror, an appetite for getting at those root causes, just as it resonated in the United States when Bernie Sanders talked about climate change as a security issue. And you know, he was mocked by the sort of elite opinion makers, but it resonated with a lot of voters.
Well, let's talk a little about the Bernie Sanders campaign and the kind of ideas that he talked about that have become more commonplace. And I want to quote from you. You're saying what for decades was unsayable is now being said out loud by candidates who win millions of votes. Free college tuition, double the minimum wage, 100% renewable energy, demilitarize the police, prisons are no place for young people, refugees are welcome here, wars make us all less safe. So could you talk a little bit about how some of those ideas have become more acceptable, and it wasn't really from Bernie Sanders' campaign?
I mean, this is the moment we're in, and it's an exciting moment from a progressive perspective, because I mean, for me, I grew up in the neoliberal era. My childhood was in the 80s, the era of Reagan and Thatcher, and there is no alternative. And that project was about advancing a set of radical so-called free market ideas: privatization, deregulation, cuts to taxes paid for with cuts to spending, accompanied by huge expansions of the security state. But that was sold based on the idea that there is no alternative to it, and it was really a project that, in so many ways, was about constraining the collective imagination. And neoliberalism, that set of policies, has been in profound crisis since the 2008 financial meltdown, for many reasons, not the least of which is that elites had to break their own rules right out, in the open, and everybody saw that it was possible to intervene in the market to save the banks, that suddenly they could find trillions of dollars after we'd all been told there was no money for schools, no money for daycares, no money for hospitals. So that the spell was broken, and we are in this period where now the progressive imagination is being unleashed. The first stage was saying no to the austerity after the 2008 economic crisis, but now the utopian imagination on the left is being rekindled. You see it in documents like the Vision for Black Lives, which comes out of the Movement for Black Lives, which is really an exciting, bold policy document that is about how to get at the underlying causes behind police violence. It's really about changing the economy, changing society, with racial justice at the center. And I've been involved in a project called The Leap. People can read about it at theleap.org, which is a similar intersectional approach. But just as progressive ideas are surging in popularity, and we're saying the unsayable, and candidacies like Bernie's or Jeremy Corbyn's or Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France are doing better than the entire expert class predicted, it's also the case that far-right ideas, white supremacist ideas, highly xenophobic ideas are also more popular than they've been at any point in my lifetime. So, I see this as a kind of race against time, because there is this vacuum where this elite consensus used to be, and as it collapses, a lot of things are shifting.
Well, another contradiction I see is that the progressive movement is way ahead of the Democratic Party, for example. You see a fight in Baltimore where the people had won through pushing the city council the right to a $15 an hour minimum wage, and the Democratic mayor of Baltimore then vetoing that. So I wonder what you think about how to move the Democratic Party that is supposed to be more progressive and yet doesn't seem to have caught up to the popular sentiment in a lot of these issues.
So, I mean, the energy is huge out there with more and more, deep progressives committed to taking power and seeing that it is possible. I think with Bernie's campaign, Bernie getting 13 million votes, carrying 22 states, there is really the belief out there that I did not have at any point in my lifetime up till now, which is that a winning progressive coalition is really within reach. It is possible, and we know that Bernie had weaknesses that he that many women of mine and your generation didn't feel comfortable that he really got. How precarious many women's rights are. Many people involved in racial justice issues didn't feel that he fully integrated a racial justice agenda into his campaign, although he got better as the campaign went on, but it wasn't enough to really capture, if he had been able to capture 50% of the black vote in key states, he would have been able to win. So it isn't that the Democratic base is too right-wing. It's that there were key constituencies that he wasn't able to reach. And I think that if that changed next time around, that winning coalition is out there and people know it. And I think if the Democratic Party does not come to its senses and keeps trying to fight off the tide of history, then people will leave the party. This is what I'm hearing. And there's very much a live debate about this. If we look at what happened in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn was fought by his own party at every single turn. He won the leadership, and then he was sabotaged by his own MPs. He faced an internal coup where they tried to unseat him as leader, and he held on. And now, after the election results, which were so surprising, where he won, I believe, 32 seats when he was supposed to have been wiped out, people are having to admit that this is actually the way to win elections. And we'll see whether the Democratic Party learns from that or not. But I don't think it's going to come easily. I think the lesson of the Corbyn campaign is that it's going to be a fight. And there are some people who think that it's not even worth fighting within the Democratic Party. And we'll see.
Yeah, it's a tough one because there are so many other examples in Europe where it hasn't been transformation from within traditional parties. It's actually been new parties that have cropped up that have captured the public imagination and won tremendous victories, whether it's Podemos in Spain or the examples of Syriza in Greece or the progressive parties in France or in Portugal. So who knows how it will go. The hard thing in the United States is that we have this winner-take-all system that makes it so difficult.
That's the really hard part. That's the really hard part. I think if there was a different electoral system that allowed for coalition governments, it would be a bit of a no-brainer in terms of starting a new party, given how much resistance there is. But this is the system that there is here.
So, Naomi, you brought up the issue of race, and you talk about it quite a lot in the book. You talk about the movement for Black lives, and you also talk about the Indigenous community. And of course, in Canada, you have a very strong Indigenous community that's been on the forefront of a lot of the environmental struggles. And you have a very compelling chapter in the book about your experience at Standing Rock. And I think your view about how we move to a different society is one where people of color and the wisdom of Indigenous communities has to be in the lead. So how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, I guess I'm a journalist first and foremost, and this book comes from talking to a whole lot of people in movements who are organizing, and this is this is, I think, the wisdom of our movement at this point. This is where the energy of organizing is. In Canada, every single key environmental battle has always been led by Indigenous people, and this is true to a large extent in the United States as well. That chapter on Standing Rock I wrote because it was so moving to be there when I was there, which was when the Obama administration finally denied the easement. But Trump had already won the election, and so people understood that this victory was really on borrowed time, that Trump was going to go in and probably reverse it. But the reason why I wanted to include that experience in the book is because the kind of leadership that I saw in Standing Rock and the people that I spoke to, like LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, Cody Tubers, who's a Standing Rock Sioux Council member, Chase Iron Eyes, the analysis was so deeply holistic and intersectional, right? That this was a racial justice battle. That the pipeline had originally been rooted through Bismarck, an overwhelmingly white city, and had been rejected because of concerns over water quality. So it was moved to underneath the single drinking water source for the Standing Rock Sioux. A just absolutely classic example of environmental racism. So that was one piece of it, but it was also very much about climate change and understanding that we cannot keep expanding the fossil fuel frontier and have any hope of protecting a livable planet for our kids. And it was also profoundly about standing up to corporate power, about standing up to increasingly militarized police, because of course the water protectors at Standing Rock were up against a police force that looked like an army, tanks and all the privatized surveillance equipment and tricks. And so, I quote Winona LaDuke in the book about how it was all of it. And, you can talk about intersectionality, which is a wonderful phrase from Kimberly Crenshaw, African-American legal scholar and feminist, who has given us this term that so many of us are using. But in Standing Rock, it was just life. It was, and I think it's helpful, sometimes to not talk about something in theory, but to talk about it as a lived experience and how it is playing out on the land and on people's bodies.
Which you also bring up in the Standing Rock chapter, in which I saw myself having traveled there, is that it was about winning the rights to the land and to do what they want with their property, but it was also showing a different way of living together, and how this was an experience that profoundly changed the people who came to see what it was like to be in a struggle under the leadership of the Indigenous people, and how different that is than many other struggles have been, the profound sense of connection to the land, even the language of water protectors, not protesters. Mm-hmm. And do you think that this will carry on or has had an impact on people who are part of this movement?
I think everyone who was there was changed by it, and Standing Rock also really embodied the title of the book, No is Not Enough, because as soon as the victory was won to stop the pipeline, it was a temporary victory, as we know, but it's not over. They've also won an important legal victory that what Trump has done in pushing through this pipeline without proper environmental assessment is illegal. So they haven't stopped fighting. But as soon as that ruling came down from the Army Corps of Engineers, immediately everybody who I talked to wanted to say, okay, now the real work starts. Now we can turn this reservation into a shining example of a justice-based transitions off of fossil fuels. We want to get to 100% renewable energy. We want to start building the economy that would never need a new oil pipeline. And so it was like the no was necessary to be able to get to the yes, right? And I think that this is sort of where we are. We have to weave the no and the yes together, and that was so inspiring. And in terms of how this plays out, I mean, the truth is we don't know. And I've been involved in social movements for long enough to never believe a movement obituary. Our movements are always declared over. Whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's the so-called anti-globalization movement. But those of us who've been involved in these struggles know that that the infrastructure, the ideas, the teaching, the people that were part of earlier movements resurface, reemerge, learn from past mistakes. So I don't think movements die. They go into periods of gestation and reemerge and turn into something else, right? Occupy Wall Street turned into Occupy Sandy, responding to Hurricane Sandy, and then many people from Occupy went on to form the digital backbone of Bernie Sanders's campaign, and are continuing to learn new lessons, share information, and evolve. So we just don't know where those teachings go.
Well, I want to also emphasize that in your book, while you're not naive about how dangerous the Trump administration is, I love the analogy you used to being in those automatic tennis things where you're being hit by the balls constantly and you're taking a swing and you might get one or two, but you feel like you're always being battered. On the other hand, you talk about that the Trump agenda is not all controlling and the Trump space is not all controlling. And I just want to read from this part where you say, they don't control what cities and states do. They don't even control what Congress does a lot of the time. They certainly don't control universities, faith institutions, unions. They don't control what the courts do, yet you have in parentheses. They don't control what other sovereign nations do, and they do not control what we do as individuals and groups around the world. And for me, this was very inspiring, this section of the book, because you do lay out for us that we have a lot of spaces in which we do not have to just be saying no, 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 but where we are building up these alternatives, whether it's on the very small level of the way you live your life, or whether it's on the global level of how we can reignite some of the global alliances that we've had in the past after Trump said no to the Paris agenda, how the world community came together to say we are moving ahead anyway. So can you talk a little about those spaces that Trump does not control?
Right, and I think specifically because what Trump and his administration are doing is so dangerous with what they do control, and what they control is significant. The onus on us to do more in all of these un-Trumpified spaces is all the greater. I guess I started thinking about this when I was speaking. I was speaking at Harvard, just giving a lecture early on in the administration, and there has been an absolutely ferocious fight at Harvard over fossil fuel divestment. Harvard has one of the strongest fossil fuel divestment movements in the country, but the administration has been really intransigent with them. And it's really important for the fossil fuel divestment movement because, of course, Harvard is so iconic. And if Harvard were to make the decision, it would help other schools and other institutions to also make a similar decision. And talking to some of the activists there, I really realized that the arguments of during the Obama years that the school used to make was, we don't really think divestment is the most effective way to fight climate change. We think it's more effective to have policy, and there was a credible possibility, right, that the Obama administration would introduce policy that would be, quite strong. They introduced the Clean Power Plan, which was not strong enough, but it wasn't nothing. Of course, it's being undone by Trump. And because there is no credible prospect at this moment of federal legislation on climate change, of a real carbon tax, for instance, that argument is gone. And anywhere where we do have power, we have to use it. And I during the DNC, when Michelle Obama said, "When they go low, we go high," right? I think that that was probably the best line of the convention. she was talking about tone and not wanting to join Trump and his gang in the gutter of slurs and attacks. I think we should adopt that similar approach, but as it relates to policy, as it relates to action, that as the Trump administration lowers the bar, as they go rogue, we have to raise the bar everywhere where we have power. And I think an amazing example of this was the mayor of Pittsburgh after Trump announced the Paris withdrawal and invoked the city of Pittsburgh, saying he was elected by the people of Pittsburgh, not the people of Paris. The next day, you had the mayor of Pittsburgh stepping up and saying, well, actually, Pittsburgh voted for Hillary, and I'm going to get the city to 100% renewable energy by 2035, which is the most ambitious target in the country. I think Portland is the only other city that has adopted a target that ambitious. So that's an example of what I mean, of people using the power that they do have to advance a powerful progressive vision. I think we're seeing something similar with healthcare in California, the California Senate moving one step closer to single payer precisely because what Congress and Trump are doing in healthcare is so dangerous. And I think, Medea, we may well be in a position to advance something similar when it comes to free trade. I mean, when they are seriously renegotiating NAFTA to make it more like the TPP, that's going to be an opening for, for workers' movements, for environmentalists, for everybody concerned about our economy to come forward and say, no, this is how you write a fair trade agreement. This is what it would look like, and really say what we think it would look like. Because when we were fighting these deals back in the day, we were pretty good at saying no, but we weren't as good at saying yes.
Well, as we're winding down now, Naomi, I just want to, as an activist, one, thank you for saying now the lines are blurred, that we have to all be activists, and two, giving us this beautiful way of looking at the Trump agenda, not as something that is so enormous that we don't want to get out of bed in the morning because we don't even want to think about it, but as a challenge to us that we have to take extremely seriously, but that gives us a lot of not only spaces within which to work, but whole new communities to work with. And I think as you go forward on your book tour, getting more and more people excited about being part of these solutions and showing the enormous potential that these solutions have, we as a community, as a nation, and as a global community will be much better at articulating the yes that we want to live in. And so thank you so much for the work, the book. Again, No is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. Thank you so much, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Medea.